Hello, 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 and welcome back to another fantastic episode of Captain Patriotic. I'm your host, Eric Holsenbach, and let's go dive on into some history, guys. So, for any of you guys that tuned in last time, you'll probably recall that we talked in extensive details about one of the most famous, or some people might refer to it as one of the most infamous wars that America has participated in our history. Now, what conflict, you ask? Well, that particular one, you guys, I'm talking about is none other than the Vietnam War. And if you'll recall the last two episodes, I talked in extensive details about how the U.S. became involved in such a grisly conflict. Vietnam started out as basically a colonial power of the French in the late 1800s. Well, a guy named Ho Chi Minh came up with the idea of, we don't need to be ruled by these French rulers. We can be our own independent government. So he starts to overthrow the French colonial government at that time. And things really started to heat up in the 1950s whenever they defeat the French at a crucial battle, which basically threw the French out of Vietnam altogether. So in the 1950s is kind of where the tensions started to rise over there, but the U.S. decided to stay out of it because at that time we had just gotten out of Korea and we're wanting some downtime and some peacetime after both World War II and Korea. But nonetheless, President Eisenhower decides to send advisors to basically help and train the South Vietnamese to defend themselves against the North Vietnamese government. Well, what started out as a support role basically became an active duty role for the U.S. come into the 1960s. Now, that is the main time frame and the main heat of the war in Vietnam, because that is when a bunch of physical violence starts erupting between both North and South Vietnam. And during the mid-1960s, that's when it became clear that the South Vietnamese could not defend themselves for nothing, and they really, really needed U.S. help with protecting themselves from North Vietnam and Russia. So nonetheless, we send our guys in, and it just becomes a gory mess altogether. A lot of people back home really protested the war, saying that it was an unjust war or an unfair war, what have you. Well, this continued well into the 60s and into the early 1970s before President Nixon withdraws troops altogether and basically made the South Vietnamese defend themselves against North Vietnam altogether. So, this is kind of just a basic recap of what occurred during the Vietnam War. Now, for the next few episodes, I want to draw our attention to a handful of unique individuals in Arkansas history. Now, these next three folks that we're going to be talking about over these next few episodes have one thing in common, and that is all three of these unique men have all had the privilege of earning perhaps the most prestigious honor that a soldier, Marine, sailor, or any service member for that matter could ever receive in his or her military career. And that, my folks, is the presidential, or I should say, Congressional Medal of Honor. And today we are going to be diving into the background and story of one of these folks that have received the Medal of Honor for heroic action in Vietnam. And that particular individual, my folks, that we're going to be talking about today is none other than United States Army First Lieutenant George Sisler. Now, Sisler was a 1964 graduate of Arkansas State University who received his Medal of Honor citation for heroic actions while he was serving with a Special Forces unit in Vietnam during the early part of 1967. George Sisler was born on September 19, 1937 in Dexter, Missouri, to his dad, George R. Sisler, and his mama, Grace Franchetta Sisler. And basically, George lived in Dexter, Missouri for the first part of his life, all the way through elementary, middle school, even parts of high school. Well, upon graduating from high school, George worked at various jobs, trying to figure out what he really wanted to do in his life. I'm sure some of us can relate to that. Well, one day, out of the blue, he decides to enlist in the United States Air Force. So when that happens, Sisler ultimately serves his 4 years in the Air Force between 1958 through 1962. Well, of course, during this particular time, there was no direct war in Vietnam. I mean, it was actually pretty quiet for the most part. He didn't see any action overseas whatsoever. Well, upon leaving the Air Force in 1962, he decides to attend Arkansas State University in Jonesboro, where during his time there, he joined the Sigma Pi fraternity, and he also distinguished himself by winning the 1963 National Collegiate Skydiving Championship, despite having one of his legs in a cast. So he was a pretty outgoing guy, a very, very hardworking individual, pretty smart from what all of his colleagues and co-workers were saying about him. Well, all this hard work paid off because in 1964, he graduates from ASU with a BS in education, and he was a really, really smart individual. So not only did he graduate in 1964, but it was around that time that the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred in Vietnam, which ultimately, in a way, pushed the U.S. to become actively involved in the Vietnam War. So you can only imagine what was going on in the country at this time. People had a bunch of civil unrest about, what exactly is going to go on in Vietnam? That's basically where the pressure of the U.S. getting more involved to fight for the South Vietnamese really became concurrent, and this is where they started the draft and getting people, basically forced them to join the military. So in a way, George saw this as a higher calling. So after graduating, he decides to enlist in the U.S. Army on August 20th, 1964. Now, after he enlists, and given his education background and everything, he was among one of the smartest recruits that the Army had recruited at that particular time, at least in his unit. So because he had an advanced degree and all that, not only did he gain a rank promotion in the Army really quickly, but they also saw a unique gift in him, the Army did, and that, my folks, encouraged him to become a member of the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Corps, which he stayed in for the term that he served in the military, in the Army specifically. Now, as far as his actual service in Vietnam, Sisler actually was sent to Vietnam as a first lieutenant and intelligence officer with the headquarters company of the 5th Special Forces, part of the Airborne Division, 1st Special Forces Unit. And he was serving as the platoon leader and advisor of a platoon of combined U.S. Marine and Army, as well as South Vietnamese soldiers deep behind enemy lines on February 7th, 1967. Well, it was on this fateful day that they were attacked from 3 sides by a company-sized enemy force, which is roughly about, I would say, 200 soldiers, give or take a few. So his men is surrounded by all of these North Vietnamese on all 3 sides of them. They really didn't have anywhere else to go but turn back, but that is where the leader role in him kicked in, and he encouraged all of his men to hold your ground. Don't let the enemy get to us and get back to our base camp. I mean, he was a very high motivator, and he did anything and everything to give the morale and motivation to his fellow soldiers, Marines, and South Vietnamese members of his company and unit at that time. It was during that fateful attack that Sisler quickly rallied his men and established a defensive perimeter where they could call airstrikes on their enemy attackers with no problem. However, what he failed to realize during that time was that two of his men were outside the perimeter, as far as they called it, the safety zone, where they would be protected from the bombers. Basically, these two guys were in the area that was about to be bombed by the U.S. military and eliminate all those enemy troops. So, according to his Medal of Honor citation, Sisler charged from that position through intense enemy fire to assist those soldiers. He was carrying one of the men back to his lines whenever they came under enemy heavy fire. Now, laying the man down, Sisler killed 3 onrushing enemy soldiers by firing his rifle, and as well as silenced an enemy machine gun position with a grenade that was fired directly on his guys. Now, just as Sisler had just brought the wounded soldier back within the defensive perimeter, that was when another intense enemy attack threatened his left flank and wounded several more of his men. Now, according to his citation again, First Lieutenant Sisler picked up some grenades and charged single-handedly into the enemy onslaught while firing his weapon and throwing grenades at the enemy. Now, his one-man attack forced the enemy to retreat, but as Sisler moved along his men, basically to secure the perimeter, and he was doing this, he was calling in additional airstrikes and everything. He was mortally wounded by an enemy sniper just out of the blue, but his actions would not go unrecognized whatsoever. In fact, his widow, Jane, as well as his 2 boys, David and James, received his Medal of Honor posthumously from the Secretary of War, Stanley R. Resor, on June 27, 1968, well over a full year after this battle took place that ultimately ended his life. I don't know about you guys, but that's a lot of guts to go through basically an enemy mob like that, single-handedly taking out a whole company size of soldiers by yourself, as well as to protect the wounded soldiers that are in your company at the same time. Man, I don't know how I would have reacted to that, but man, this guy was a true hero, and it really showed with his sacrifice and his commitment to his men like that. I mean, this honor was well deserved for him and his family, to say the least. Well, 30 years later, in 1998, a non-commissioned U.S. Navy support vessel, which was named the USS Sisler in his honor, was launched out in the sea. There are a lot of places that are named in honor of this young hero, because at such a young age, he had such an impact from his days at ASU to his time in the Army, even beforehand. I mean, this guy was stuff of legends, to say the least. And based off of his history, I could see why people really praised the guy, because he was really easy to get along with. He would give you the shirt off his back. I mean, he would do anything and everything to help you out in a pinch, to say the least. Now, there is a Sisler Hall where in a building at Fort Hotche, Arizona, which is named after him. But back at ASU, where he is an alum, there is also Sisler's Range, which is a new firing range at Arkansas State University in Jonesboro, where he went to school. And man, there is even the ASU ROTC's department's Ranger Challenge team is named Sisler's Raiders in his honor, because he was such a dedicated soldier. Now, Sisler is ultimately buried in Dexter Cemetery in his hometown of Dexter, Missouri. Obviously, he was from there, but he has a lot of ties to Arkansas. And in fact, he is said to have made a bunch of changes to modernize the fraternities as well as the organizations that are there at Jonesboro right now. And his name is actually included on panel 15E 007 on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. So, you guys, this is a short but very impactful story, in my opinion. I mean, to grow up where you did, to basically come from nothing to becoming something of glory, I couldn't imagine what it was like, one, to first sign up in the Air Force and did your mandatory 4 years, but two, to become a dedicated student like he was at ASU and got his bachelor's degree. Even before joining the Army, I mean, that's pretty impressive all in itself. But what I like most about him is his selflessness and his willingness to put his country before himself, just like he rightfully did so during this particular battle in 1967 that earned him his Medal of Honor citation. So you guys, if you have any questions or want me to expand on any more of his history, please feel free to leave a like and a comment down below. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you might have. As always, guys, thank you for tuning in, and please stick around for next time. Thank you.